All right, let's get into this. It's an incredible story that kicks off with this one single, spectacular disaster. But what it really does is uncover a much bigger, almost hidden tragedy. It's a tale of two completely different kinds of ships, and it shows how the visibility of a disaster can literally mean the difference between life and death for decades to come. Can you just imagine hearing this live on your radio? This was the scene on a stormy night back in 1934. A luxury liner, the SS Morro Castle, has become this terrifying, raging inferno, and it's happening right off the coast of New Jersey. Its burned-out hulk is just drifting toward the beach in front of thousands of horrified people.
So, to really get why this one shipwreck changed everything, we've got to go back to its last chaotic hours. We're talking about a voyage that started in total luxury and ended in a complete nightmare, one that would echo for a very, very long time.
Now, just look at how quickly things went from bad to catastrophic. This is a total cascade of failure. Around 8 p.m., the captain dies, suddenly and pretty mysteriously. Then, just a few hours later, a fire breaks out. But look at the time. The first SOS call doesn't go out for another 25 minutes. That's a lifetime in an emergency like this. It wasn't just one thing going wrong. It was a complete chain reaction of disaster.
You know, the ship itself was basically a tinderbox. The Morro Castle was modern, sure, but all that luxury became a deadly liability. It had this early version of an air conditioning system that just funneled air and fire through the gaps behind the walls. And those walls, they were covered in layers and layers of highly flammable varnish. So the fire didn't just burn, it literally raced through the ship's veins. And right in the middle of all this chaos is this guy, the chief radio operator, George Sparks Rogers. To the public, he was an absolute hero who stayed at his post, sending out distress calls through all the smoke. But behind the scenes, well, the circumstances were deeply suspicious. The captain, right before he died, was worried about sabotage. And Rogers himself later described in chilling detail how a simple fountain pen could be turned into a timed fire starter. It just adds this whole other layer of mystery to the tragedy.
The response to the fire was just a total breakdown. The crew was completely untrained for this kind of thing. Passengers had no clue where their lifeboats even were. And the boats themselves? A lot of them were stuck, sealed shut by years of paint. The fire hoses lost pressure almost immediately. It was absolute pandemonium.
Okay, so what happens after the flames die down? This is where the story pivots. We're going to see how this spectacular, horrifically public disaster actually forced a massive change, not just for one ship, but for an entire industry.
In the end, 137 people, passengers and crew, lost their lives. They died in the fire, or they died after jumping into the frigid, storm-tossed Atlantic Ocean. It was just a staggering loss of life. And here is exactly why this disaster was different. The ship didn't just sink out in the middle of the ocean. No, it ran aground on a popular beach. For months, the Morro Castle just sat there, this haunting, smoking monument to what happened. You couldn't ignore it. It literally became a tourist attraction. It was this constant, unavoidable reminder of the lives that were lost. And that's the key, right? Because everyone saw what happened to the Morro Castle. It directly led to new laws that made passenger ships so much safer. The public outrage was so intense, Congress had no choice but to act. They mandated things we take for granted now, like fire-retardant materials and proper safety drills, changes that have, no doubt, saved countless lives since.
But this is where our story takes a really sharp turn. See, the lessons from the Morro Castle saved passengers, but they didn't apply to everyone at sea. There was an entire industry that was just left behind, a forgotten fleet.
So you would think, right? You'd think a lesson this painful, this public, would be applied everywhere at sea. You'd assume that safety would become the #1 priority for all ships. But the truth? Well, it's way more complicated than that.
The answer lies in this simple, almost invisible bureaucratic term, an uninspected vessel. It sounds harmless, but this one classification created a truly deadly loophole. For most of the 20th century, this category applied to pretty much the entire U.S. commercial fishing fleet. And what that meant was they were invisible to the very safety regulations the Morro Castle disaster had inspired.
And this slide, it perfectly illustrates the two separate worlds that were created. On one side, you have passenger ships entering this new era of really strict safety rules. But on the other side, commercial fishing boats were just left to operate in a kind of wild west of no rules. Think about that. No standards for how the boats were built, no mandatory inspections to see if they were even seaworthy, and minimal, if any, safety requirements for the crew. And here is the truly unbelievable irony in all this. The fishing fleet actually got less safe as its technology got better. The old steam-powered trawlers, they were inspected. But when the industry switched over to more modern diesel engines in the 1930s, this bizarre legislative loophole reclassified them as uninspected. And just like that, all that safety oversight, it just vanished.
Now, this regulatory gap, this wasn't some simple oversight. It was the result of decades of failed attempts at reform. It was a long, tragic history of missed opportunities to save lives.
I mean, this timeline is just devastating to look at. It shows that for decades, every single time tragedy struck the fishing fleet, the response from lawmakers was inaction. In 1941, a bill is proposed. It fails. In the 50s, after terrible losses, more bills are introduced. They all fail. In 1971, the Coast Guard itself says, hey, we need inspections, but the plan is shelved. Over and over again, the result was always the same. No new rules and more lives lost.
So even when a major safety act finally did pass in 1988, it was a massive compromise. It gave fishermen better tools to survive a disaster, things like immersion suits and emergency beacons, but it did almost nothing to prevent the disasters from happening in the first place. It just called for studies on inspection and licensing, but it didn't actually require them. And those studies, they were actually completed. Detailed plans for vessel inspection and operator licensing were drawn up and sent straight to Congress. These were the plans that could have finally turned the corner, from just responding to tragedies to actually preventing them, and they were simply ignored.
And this quote right here, it really gets to the heart of the problem. This was the prevailing attitude for decades. It was this idea that fishing was just a dangerous job, and the lives lost, well, that was just the cost of doing business. A risk taken by the fishermen and for the fishermen alone.
Remember this number? The Morro Castle lost 137 souls in one horrific, very public night. It was a spectacle of failure that shocked the entire nation and changed the rules for passengers forever. But the slow, steady, and unseen loss of life in the fishing industry, one or two boats sinking at a time, lost in a storm, far from any cameras, it failed to trigger that same urgent response. Each sinking was its own private tragedy, but when you put them all together, they formed an epidemic that was almost entirely ignored. Which leaves us with this final, really haunting question. It was posed by a government task force more than 20 years ago, but it's the same question safety advocates are still asking today. After everything we've learned from these two very different stories, you have to ask yourself, what price do we put on a human life at sea? And does it still depend on who's watching?